To the Jews, Palestine is their traditional and spiritual home, the promised land. But the majority of the inhabitants of Palestine are Arabs. They too regard Palestine as their rightful home. But with the end of the war, into Palestine ports came ship after ship crammed with illegal immigrants, refugees from recent persecution in Germany, Austria, Poland, Belsen, and Dachau. The Arabs, fearful of becoming a minority, persuaded the British to limit Jewish immigration. Jewish extremists attacked British troops, wrecked government buildings, blew up trains and ships. And so Palestine remains a place of martial law, where all go their ways only under watch, where the innocent must suffer with the guilty.
Palestine. One land, two peoples. 50 years ago, the British rulers washed their hands of Palestine. The Jews saw their chance to declare their own state. The Arabs were determined to stop them. In the months before the British left, Arabs and Jews turned on each other. Palestine slid into civil war. Desperate for allies, the Jews appealed to the world's greatest power to help them realize their dream of a state of their own.
America התחרטה על מה שעשו. לא הנשיא, אבל הסטייט דפרטמנט לא יכול להמציא להתערב. הם יצאו בהודעה ככה שהוחלט כבר. לא mandat, לא מדינה.
Ben-Gurion sent his close colleague Moshe Sharett to beg the Americans to recognize the proposed Jewish state.
An unhesitating decision.
Sharett had to persuade Secretary of State George Marshall, the man President Truman called the greatest living American. Marshall was totally opposed to the creation of the Jewish state, convinced it would lead to years of war in the Middle East. 6 days before the British were to leave Palestine, Sharett and his team met Marshall. Without support from Washington, a Jewish state could not survive.
Sharett explained that we have no other way than to proceed. This is a historic juncture. If we miss that, we may create a tragedy for future generations. Marshall said to Sharett, well, it's your decision. Don't count that we can bail you out.
But the president backed the Jews' demand for a state of their own in Palestine.
I was told by all these so-called experts that if it was done, it would involve the whole Near East in a war, and it would also involve the United States. Hitler had been murdering Jews right and left. I saw it, and I dream about it even to this day. The Jews needed some place where they could go. It was my attitude that the American government couldn't stand idly by while the victims of Hitler's madness were not allowed to build new lives.
Marshall could not hide his scorn for such thinking.
We are in the midst of a very critical situation. We should, therefore, carefully avoid approaching international problems on an emotional basis.
2 days before the British were to leave Palestine, Truman summoned Marshall to the White House. To avoid an open clash with him, the president instructed his counsel to present the case for recognizing a Jewish state.
General Marshall started off. The president listened attentively and then said, I would like now to hear from Clark. But as I spoke, I saw Marshall's face getting redder and redder. And when I finished, he exploded.
Marshall accused him of a transparent dodge to win the Jewish vote, as Clifford later reported.
Clark Clifford did not disguise the fact that Marshall was raging mad. They don't need a state, they don't deserve a state, it isn't theirs. They've stolen that land. These were Marshall's words.
And he said, Mr. President, I do not know what's going on here. He said, the fact is, I don't know even why Clifford is attending this meeting. The President said quietly, General, he's here because I invited him. The general sat there. You could kind of feel the stirring within him. He turned to the President, said, I'm obliged, Mr. President, to tell you that if you should adopt the policy that is recommended by Clifford, I would be unable to vote for you in this coming election in November. Well, dead silence in the room. No one had ever heard anything like that. I had never heard anybody threaten the President of the United States in that manner.
Before Marshall could go any further, Truman ended the meeting.
I gathered my papers together, and the President said, well, that was tough as a cob.
I was up to here and experts from the Army, the Navy, and the State Department.
The President would not move without Marshall, and in Palestine, Marshall's prediction of war seemed about to come true. 5 Arab states mobilized on the borders, threatening to overrun Palestine as soon as the British colonial forces left. The Jewish leader saw his moment to create a state slipping away. He decided the Jews of Palestine would have to go it alone.
ביום סיום המנדט הבריטי על ארץ ישראל, תוקף זכותנו הטבעית וההיסטורית, אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
The Jews had more than they realized to celebrate. Ben-Gurion's declaration presented Marshall with a fait accompli. He gave in, and President Truman became the first world leader to recognize Israel. Ben-Gurion shared his triumph with Moshe Sharett and made him foreign minister. But in time, they would clash, opening a breach in Israeli politics that has never healed. For Ben-Gurion, Israel's survival would depend less on diplomacy than on the sword.
המדינה תקום רק בכוח הכוח היהודי שהולך ומתארגן. בגדולתו, מצבה, תחומיה, גם כן יקבעו על ידי זה.
אנחנו פה לא שמעתי את הכרזת המדינה, את המאורע הגדול הזה. גמרו איזה קרב, ואז יצחק רבין פתח את הרדיו, ושם כל החיילים שוכבים, עייפים מהמלחמה, ושומעים שם בן גוריון מדבר, מכריז על העצמאות, קורא את מגילת העצמאות. אז חייל אחד אומר, חבר'ה, תסגרו את הרדיו הזה, נשמע את זה אחר כך, אין לנו כוח. סגרו את הרדיו, שכבו לישון.
The weary soldiers were defending the road to Jerusalem, under siege by the Palestinian Arabs. From the moment the British began to leave, keeping the Jews of Jerusalem from starvation became the first priority of the Jewish army, the Haganah.
We started with military operations to make sure that the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem will not be endangered by the big villages or towns that were along the road were from, came all the attackers on the convoys.
שבא שיירה, אז כל העיר ידע, הגיעה שיירה, ויוצאים לדרך ורואים מסעית מורידה, שקים של קמח, שקים של זה, גפרורים. למי יש גפרורים? איפה יש גפרורים? סיגריות, סיגריות. איפה יש סיגריות? וחיילים בלי סיגריות? לחם, אוכל, כל זה היה תלוי אם תבוא שיירה מתל אביב.
The Haganah stepped up its operations to prevent Palestinian villagers from sheltering fighters.
Well, it was not pleasant. The system was to attack the village, to give warning to the civilians, to destroy the village. And by the elimination of the villages alone and adjacent to the road, we were sure that there would be no attacks.
ضيعوها البلد راح صار عليك يا دير ياسين صار عليك يا دير ياسين وعلى شبابك على ايامك الحلوه.
The events at Deir Yassin, 1 month before independence, would scar relations between Jews and Arabs for years to come. In the 5 months since the civil war began, Deir Yassin had kept out of the fighting. It was not on the Haganah's list of hostile villages. But the Haganah had some dangerous allies. One, a small terrorist group, the Stern Gang, joined up with another, the Irgun, best known for blowing up the British military headquarters in the King David Hotel. Deir Yassin was where they planned to prove themselves against the Palestinians.
במקרה בירושלים נפגשתי עם חבר לשעבר, שהיה פעם בפלמ"ח, ואומר לי פתאום, שהוא איש לח"י, ושלח"י ואצ"ל קיבלו אישור מדוד שאלתיאל לתקוף את הכפר דיר יאסין בעוד כמה ימים. הוא מאוד התגאה.
והוא הוטל על כוחות האצ"ל והלח"י, הוא הוטל על ידי מפקדת המחוז שהייתה אז האצ"ל, הלח"י וההגנה, הוא הוטל על כוחות האצ"ל והלח"י לכבוש את דיר יאסין.
רצתי אל דוד שאלתיאל ואמרתי לו, למה אתה מאשר להם? הוא אומר, באמת, הצעתי להם 2 אלטרנטיבות, והם לא רצו. אז אמרתי, אז למה השארת להם? אז הוא אמר, מה אני אעשה? אני אראה להם בגב? אז אמרתי, אתה יודע מה, אם ככה, אני אכנס יחד איתם בכפר, בלי להגיד להם.
The Jews counted on a show of force and a warning from their loudspeakers to clear the village before sunrise.
كان يطلعوا في مكبرات الصوت ألقوا السلاح ونفدوا برواح شوف. فسمعنا حس ضربة الرشاش. عاد إحنا عندنا تعليمات الرشاش ما ينضربش إلا بحالة خطر يعني. والله أنا قاعد هيك مجنبز، رفعت البرداية الطاقة قدامي، أنا طلعت البلد شعلة نار ولا هي أضواء كاشفة على كل القرية.
The village was not the soft target the Jews had expected.
כי עובדה שמהחלונות ומהבתים האלה נורתה אש על חיילינו, ומכוח של 132 איש היו לנו 42 פצועים ו6 הרוגים.
The commander, a former petty officer in the Royal Navy, ordered a house-to-house attack.
פקדתי שלא נכנסים לאף בית מבלי להפעיל את המטען או לזרוק רימון או 2 רימונים לתוכו.
ضربوا قنبله محرقه كلها حركه دار صغيره بنت بين 28 واحد.
ולא היה ניתן לתקוף את בסיסי האויב מבלי שבני משפחותיהם ייפגעו, עד כמה שהדבר מצער, עד כמה שהדבר כואב, ואני אומר את זה באמת מתוך צער שהיה עלינו לעשות את זה, אבל לא הייתה ברירה אחרת.
واخذوا بيطلع حوالي 14 شاب اسرى، ولما خلصت عند قبعات شاول وقفوهم في ان كسارها يا بيعرف ابن عمي هناك، وقفوهم هناك رشوهم رشه واحده ورموهم في المحاجر. هذه حادثه.
אני ראיתי במו עיניי את ה-20-25 גברים מוכנסים לקוורי, מעמידים אותם שם על הקיר של המחצבה, וירו בהם, פשוט, בלי חוכמות. והם הומתו בירייה. עוד זה נמשך, התחילו להיכנס אל הכפר אנשים יהודיים משכונת גבעת שאול. רובם דתיים, דרך אגב. והתחילו לצעוק עליהם. רוצחים, מה אתם עושים? מנובלים. איך אתם עושים דבר כזה? קצת בעברית, קצת ביידיש, כל הזמן. וזה מה שהפסיק את הטבח.
Every Arab was driven from Deir Yassin. Survivors headed for Jerusalem. Here, their leaders would make a terrible mistake.
إحنا لما وصلنا القدس أخذونا على فندق في باب الخليل. شايف كيف؟ هناك اتجمعنا مع بعضنا وصرنا نتفكر في بعضنا أنو اللي راح أنو اللي كذا. اجت اللجنة القومية بما فيهم الدكتور حسين فخري خالدي.
فقلت له إيه رأيك كيف نغطي هالموضوع؟ فقال لي يا حازم أنا رأيي إنه نعطيه أكبر دعاية ممكنة. وأعطاني بيان اللي بتحدث فيه عن مذبحة دير ياسين وعن الاعتداء على السيدات والاعتداء على الأطفال وكل هالأشياء.
Arab radio stations put out wildly exaggerated reports of what happened at Deir Yassin, ignoring the protests of the witnesses.
ذبح أو طبيعة حبالة هذه ما حصلت. قال لا بدنا تقولوا هذا مشان نخلي 7 جيوش عربية تقوم تحرر فلسطين من اليهود.
وهذا بعتبره أكبر خطأ فادح ارتكبناه سنة 48. ما كنا ظاهر نفهم عقلية شعبنا، عقلية الشعب الفلسطيني. فما أن سمع الشعب الفلسطيني باللي حصل بدير ياسين واعتداء على الأعراض وعلى هالشيء هذا إلا ما شفنا إلا بدأ يرحل من كل هالقرى اللي كان موجود فيها.
The clearing of Palestinian villages continued. In the next few months, over half the Arab population, 750,000 people, fled their homes in Palestine. Israel has never allowed them back.
عمي أخو أبويا بين هالكتاب ما بنعرف مش قادرين ندخل من الشيك اللي ناصر.
شايف هذا البيت قبل لصاحب الدار هذا.
هذا لا لك.
هذا في منجرة.
The day after Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel, the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria attacked. But the largest Arab army, Egypt's, had been tested only on the parade ground. At its head was the playboy King Farouk.
The king hadn't had any experience of war. Nobody, in fact, had any experience of war, including the commander-in-chief of the Egyptian army, you see.
إن دايما في الناحية العسكرية في حاجة اسمها الاستكشاف، الإعداد، وحتى ذهنيا إحنا مش جاهزين. فحصل ارتباك بالنسبة للناس المنفذين، يعني اللي هم العسكريين اللي هيقوموا بالعملية.
I took the whole matter to Farouk, who showed himself well aware of the criticisms and the objections to going to war. But on the other hand, he felt that Egypt had committed herself at the UN, that the other Arabs likewise had committed themselves, that the idea of war existed, and that we couldn't very easily back out of it.
Still, the Arab states, with a population of 40 million, looked certain to overwhelm Israel's 500,000 Jews. It seemed Ben-Gurion's new state would last only a few days.
We thought it was going to be a pushover,
that the Jews were going to run away the moment they saw the Arab regular army uniform moving onto them with bayonets and whatever.
Egypt's army, attacking from the south, headed towards the main Jewish centre, Tel Aviv. Jordan's Arab Legion took the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem. The Syrians moved towards Nazareth, while the Lebanese attacked from the north. The Israelis were fighting for their survival, and after 3 weeks of fierce resistance, they brought the Arabs to a standstill. Exhausted, all parties agreed to a ceasefire. While Israelis mourned their dead, their government combed the world for arms.
I had a big victory over Ben Gurion.